Why is there an occupation? It's really important to understand. And it's important also to understand how much the Israelis have wrestled with it. Back in 1949, after the Egyptians left the war, they signed a ceasefire agreement with the Israelis. And then probably the most successful general of that war on the Israeli side, Yigal Allon, came to the Israeli cabinet and he said, I have a plan. We can take the entirety of the West Bank from the Jordanians. The West Bank cuts Israel off at 9 miles wide in the middle. The West Bank is the highlands that overlook all their major population centers. And we can take it and we can be safe. And I can take it in 5 days, Yigal Allon told the cabinet. And the Minister of the Interior in the cabinet meeting raised his hand. He said, wait a second, but if we take the West Bank, what do we do with all the Palestinians living there? They're all going to, what? We're going to rule them? We're going to make them all Israelis? What are we going to do with it? And the decision was made in the cabinet, led by Ben-Gurion, not to take the West Bank. 19 years later, the Six-Day War breaks out. Israel's under a naval blockade by the Egyptians. Egyptian state radios announcing the war is coming. The Israelis dig mass graves in Tel Aviv in preparation for what everybody understands is going to be a disastrous war. And Uzi Nalkis, the commander of Central Command, the Israeli general in charge of a war against the Jordanians in the West Bank should it happen, actually says in a later interview a few years later about the war that there weren't really good plans for taking the West Bank. That wasn't part of the plan of the war. There were plans to take a third of the Golan Plateau from the Syrians because they were shelling Israeli towns and villages. There were plans to push back the Egyptians because the Egyptian army was the existential threat to Israel. But Jordan was not part of the plan. And then the war begins. And it was a very haphazard conquest. And they end up with the West Bank in Israeli hands. And then the question becomes, well, what do you do with the West Bank in Israeli hands? And part of these spaces are absolutely sacred, holy Jewish spaces. The Jewish quarter of the Old City was under Jordanian rule for 19 years. While the Jordanians ruled the Old City of Jerusalem, they just literally demolished everything Jewish. Medieval synagogues in the Jewish quarter of the Old City of Jerusalem were destroyed. Jordan, by the way, didn't found a Palestinian state. In the Palestine that it controlled, it annexed it, and it declared it Jordanian. That's why it's called the West Bank. It is, from the Jordanian perspective, the West Bank of the river. But Jordan did not believe in Palestinian nationalism and Palestinian statehood. It wasn't until the 80s that Jordan officially relinquished actual claim to it being part of Jordan. In other words, between the 60s and the 80s, Jordan didn't think Israel had conquered the West Bank from Palestinians. It thought it had conquered it from the legitimate ruler and owner of it, which is Jordan.